It happened on the hottest day of summer, the day my newborn stopped breathing, and the ambulance never made it through the gate. Our HOA president, Karen, decided that her rules mattered more than a dying baby. She blocked the emergency vehicle, shouting about permits and property lines while every second felt like an eternity. That was a moment something inside me broke. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was a parent pushed past the limit. And when the sirens finally went silent, I made a promise. Karen's gate would never block anyone again. You won't believe how far I went to make sure of it. When my wife and I moved into Maplewood Estates, it felt like we'd finally made it. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, neighbors waving as they walked their dogs, the kind of suburban peace we'd worked our whole lives for. We bought a corner lot with a white brick house and a little garden where my wife planted lavender by the windows. The air always smelled sweet in the mornings and on weekends. I'd push our baby stroller down the quiet lanes, feeling grateful that this would be the world my son would grow up in. The HOA brochure had promised a harmonious community committed to excellence. At first, that sounded reassuring, but within weeks, I realized harmony meant something very different to the people running it, especially to Karen. Karen was the kind of neighbor who knew everyone's business, not because she cared, but because she made it her mission to control it. She was the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA rules, always with a clipboard in one hand and a phone camera in the other. If your grass was an inch too long, you'd get a notice. If your trash cans weren't back by noon, you'd get an email. And if you questioned her authority, the entire community would hear about it on the next HOA newsletter. At first, I tried to stay polite. I smiled at her in passing, waved when she slowed her golf cart near our driveway. But there was always this look in her eyes, like she was just waiting for someone to slip up so she could remind them who really ran Maplewood Estates. When our baby was born, I thought things might ease up. Maybe she'd show some compassion, or at least give us space. Instead, the notices multiplied. She didn't like the temporary ramp I built for the stroller. She said, "Our congratulations. It's a boy." Banner violated the no exterior signage rule. Even the solar-powered fairy lights my wife hung on the porch, she said they were aesthetic hazards. Each letter came with a fine attached. Small at first, $50, then $100, then $250. It wasn't about money anymore. It was control. And Karen had plenty of it. I started noticing how the neighborhood lived under her thumb. People trimmed their hedges twice a week, kept their driveways spotless, and whispered when her golf cart passed. No one wanted trouble. She liked it that way. I told myself to ignore it, to focus on my family. But the tension was constant. Small things piling up until it felt like the walls of that perfect neighborhood were closing in. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, fate decided to test me in the cruelest way possible. Because one night, when we needed help the most, all those petty rules and power games stopped being harmless annoyances and turned into something far more dangerous. The longer we lived in Maplewood Estates, the more I realized how fragile peace really was. What began as a few polite notices from the HOA soon turned into a campaign, quiet, methodical, and suffocating. At first, I laughed it off. Everyone told me that's just how Karen is. But what they didn't understand was that she wasn't just enforcing rules, she was enforcing obedience. It started small. One morning, I found a bright orange Viliation slip taped to my mailbox. The offense. Improperly aligned mailbox height. Apparently, it sat half an inch higher than the neighborhood standard. A week later, it was another. Notice, driveway oil stain must be removed within 48 hours or subject to fine. It wasn't even oil, it was water from washing the car. Then came the inspection photos. Karen had begun driving past our house every morning in her HOA-issued golf cart, snapping pictures from the street. She'd slow down, tilt her phone just enough to make sure I noticed, and then speed off. It was psychological warfare, small acts that chipped away at your sense of privacy and peace. At first, I tried reasoning with her. I attended an HOA meeting. My first and last. The room was cold and silent. A dozen neighbors sitting in folding chairs under fluorescent lights. Karen sat at the front like a queen on her throne, surrounded by her bored retirees and busybodies who nodded at everything she said. When I tried to speak, she cut me off. "Rules are rules," she said, smiling thinly. "If you don't like them, perhaps this isn't the right community for you." The room went quiet. No one met my eyes. That was when I realized fear kept everyone in line. She didn't have power because of the HOA. She had it because no one dared stand up to her. After that meeting, things escalated. Our fines doubled, then tripled. A letter arrived claiming we had unauthorized modifications on our property, referring to the small wheelchair ramp I'd built for my wife after she injured her knee. They demanded I remove it immediately or face a $1,000 fine. I sent a letter back, explaining it was temporary, necessary for medical reasons, and fully compliant with accessibility laws. Her response: another fine and a threat of legal action. That was when I started documenting everything, every letter, every visit, every encounter. I knew something was coming. One night, around 11 p.m., I saw headlights sweep across our living room. A car idled outside, engine running. I peeked through the blinds and saw Karen's SUV. She was sitting there, phone raised, taking pictures of our porch lights. I opened the door and stepped out, but she drove off before I could say a word. The next morning, another violation notice appeared. Exterior lighting exceeds HOA brightness standard. It became obsessive, a game I never agreed to play. My wife grew anxious. She started keeping the curtains closed. We avoided walking around the block because Karen's house sat near the main entrance. Even our friends stopped visiting. Word spread fast in that neighborhood, and no one wanted to be caught in her crosshairs. But the breaking point wasn't a fine. It was something worse, a moment of cruelty that crossed every possible line. Our baby had been born prematurely. We'd spent weeks in the NICU praying for his lungs to grow strong enough to bring him home. When we finally did, our house became a sanctuary, soft blankets, a gentle hum of the air purifier, late nights rocking him in the quiet. It should have been peaceful. But Karen's notices didn't stop, even then. A week after we returned home, she sent a certified letter. "Your decorative garden rocks violate the HOA's approved color palette." I stared at the paper in disbelief. The rocks, beige and gray, were the same ones she had in her own yard. My wife begged me to ignore it, but I couldn't. It wasn't about rocks anymore. It was about respect, about decency. So I wrote her back, firm but polite. I told her that I was done being bullied, that my focus was on my family, not her petty rules. 2 days later, a tow truck arrived. Karen had reported our car as abandoned because it hadn't moved in over a week. My wife's car, the one with the car seat still strapped in, was lifted right off the driveway before I could even get outside. I shouted, waving the paperwork in my hand, but the driver just shrugged and said, "HOA orders." That night, I stood on my porch, watching the streetlights flicker. My son slept inside, wrapped in a blanket, the oxygen monitor softly beeping beside him. I could feel the anger boiling. Slow, controlled, dangerous. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't finished. And when she finally crossed the line, I would be ready. A week later, it happened. It was supposed to be an ordinary morning. My wife had just finished feeding the baby when his breathing monitor started flashing red. I called 911 instantly. The dispatcher told me help was on the way. I ran outside, opened the front gate, and cleared the driveway. I could hear the distant wail of sirens getting closer. Then, suddenly, they stopped. I ran down the street and saw it. The ambulance parked at the entrance of the community. Flashing lights reflecting off the iron gate. Karen stood in front of it, arms crossed, blocking the keypad box. The security gate was closed. She was yelling something about non-resident access and authorization protocols. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The paramedics were shouting at her to move. One of them tried to get out to open the gate manually, but she held up her HOA badge like it meant something. In those seconds, everything slowed down. My son's life, the fragile, tiny heart I had fought so hard for, was being measured against HOA rules. By the time the police arrived, the damage was done. The ambulance finally made it through, but the delay had cost us precious minutes. My son was rushed to the hospital, and I followed in a blur, gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands went numb. Thankfully, he survived. But something inside me didn't. The doctor said we were lucky. But I wasn't thinking about luck, I was thinking about that gate. The one Karen swore was for the safety of residents. The one she weaponized to feed her ego. When we returned home days later, she had the audacity to send another letter. Emergency response vehicles must be properly pre-registered to avoid delays in the future. That was the moment I decided enough was enough. No more letters. No more meetings. No more fines. I spent 3 days thinking about what I'd do. On the 4th morning before sunrise, I rented a bulldozer. It sat idle on my driveway like a sleeping beast. My hands trembled when I touched the ignition. Every ounce of anger, fear, and exhaustion burned in my chest. As the first light of dawn broke, I drove toward the gate, the same gate that had nearly cost me everything. The neighborhood was still asleep. Karen's house was just down the street. Curtains closed, her perfect little world undisturbed. I pressed the pedal down and felt the engine roar. The metal gates shattered like paper. Alarms blared. Neighbors came running out in robes and slippers, mouths open in shock. I didn't stop. I drove straight through until the twisted remains of that gate lay scattered across the pavement. Then I parked, stepped out, and waited. The police arrived minutes later, sirens slicing through the quiet morning. I didn't resist. I didn't run. I just pointed at the broken gate and said, "Now it's open." Karen stood at the end of her driveway, her face pale, phone trembling in her hand. For once, she didn't have words. And as they cuffed me, I looked her straight in the eyes, not with anger, but with something far stronger. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't destruction. It was justice, loud, messy, and long overdue. The rumble of the bulldozer still echoed through the cul-de-sac long after the engine died. Smoke drifted in the morning air, curling around the splintered remains of the HOA gate, the monument to Karen's control, now lying in a heap of twisted metal and shattered glass. Neighbors stood frozen on their lawns, clutching coffee mugs and phones, staring at the wreckage as if a ghost had just torn through their perfect little world. I didn't move. I just stood there, breathing hard, the scent of diesel thick in the air. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from release. For the first time in months, there was silence. No clipped notes taped to my door. No golf cart idling outside at midnight. No rules. Just the raw, broken truth of what she had pushed me to do. Then I heard it, the sound of sirens, again. Only this time, they weren't coming to save anyone. They were coming for me. Karen appeared from behind the line of hedges, robe clutched around her shoulders, her phone still recording. Her expression was a perfect storm of outrage and disbelief. "You'll pay for this," she shrieked. Her voice cracked, trembling between fury and fear. "You're finished in this community." The police arrived seconds later, lights flashing against the broken gate. The officer stepped out, surveying the scene with wide eyes. "Sir, what happened here?" I didn't bother lying. I pointed to the mangled remains of the iron bars and said evenly, "That gate almost killed my son. I made sure it won't happen again." Karen stormed forward, finger jabbing at me like a weapon. "He's dangerous. He destroyed HOA property. Arrest him immediately." But before the officer could speak, another car pulled up, an unmarked sedan. A woman stepped out, mid-40s, confident, calm. She flashed a badge. "Detective Monroe, County Sheriff's Office," she said. "We received multiple complaints about this HOA last week. Guess we're finally seeing what the fuss is about." Karen's face blanched. "Complaints? About me?" The detective ignored her and turned to me. "Mr. Dawson, you mind stepping aside for a moment? I'd like to understand what's been happening here." I told her everything, from the first notice about the mailbox to the night of the ambulance. Every violation, every threat, every recorded incident. I showed her the folder of letters I'd kept, the timestamps, the photos of Karen parked outside our home at night. When I got to the part about the blocked ambulance, her jaw tightened. "That was the night your son was hospitalized?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "He almost died because she wouldn't open a gate." The detective turned toward Karen, her voice sharp now. "Ma'am, is that true?" Karen crossed her arms. "The ambulance wasn't registered. We have security procedures for a reason. Procedures that delayed emergency response to an infant in medical distress." Monroe snapped. "You understand that could qualify as criminal negligence, right?" For the first time, Karen faltered. The confidence drained from her face, replaced by something raw and human panic. "I was just following the bylaws," she stammered. Monroe stepped closer. "The law doesn't bend for bylaws, ma'am." The crowd of neighbors was growing. Phones recorded every word. The HOA's untouchable queen was finally cornered, her empire of rules cracking in public view. Someone whispered she blocked the ambulance. And another, "Oh my God, I didn't know." The whispers grew louder, angrier. Karen turned in circles, scanning the faces that once avoided her gaze, the very people she'd ruled through fear. But now they weren't looking away. That was when Monroe gave the order no one expected. "Officers," she said, nodding toward Karen, "I need you to detain her for questioning. We'll be investigating potential obstruction and endangerment." The street fell silent. Karen's voice broke into a high-pitched scream. "You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president." But the officers didn't hesitate. They read her rights as she struggled, tears streaking her face. Her phone slipped from her hand and hit the pavement, the recording still running. Neighbors stood motionless, some gasping, some quietly clapping. I didn't move. I just watched as the woman who had tormented an entire community was finally being led away, her perfect image unraveling with every step. When Monroe turned back to me, her expression softened. "We'll handle the property damage situation separately," she said. "But given the circumstances, I doubt anyone here is eager to press charges against you." I almost laughed. The irony was heavy. The gate that once symbolized Karen's control was gone, and so was her power. But the story didn't end there. Later that week, an emergency HOA meeting was called, the first one Karen didn't attend. The community center was packed. People who had once whispered now spoke loudly, venting months or even years of pent-up frustration. "She'll fine me for having my kid's bike on the lawn. She banned holiday decorations. She made me repaint my shutters twice because she didn't like the shade of blue." Each story was like another stone dropped into a still pond, ripples of anger spreading through the room. When they finally turned to me, the man who had torn down the gate, I stood slowly. "I didn't destroy that gate out of rage," I said. "I did it because it became a wall between people, between reason and cruelty. This neighborhood forgot what it means to be a community. We let one person turn control into punishment. We all did, and it cost us almost everything. The room was silent. Then someone clapped. Then another. By the end of the night, a motion was passed to dissolve the existing HOA board and hold new elections. Karen's name was banned from consideration permanently. But even then, the fight wasn't quite over. A few days later, I received a call from Detective Monroe. "Just thought you'd like to know," she said. "We found records of Karen falsifying HOA expense reports and using association funds for personal purchases. Luxury spa trips, electronics, even a set of custom gates ordered under the HOA's name." I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of months begin to lift. "So she's done." "Looks that way," Monroe replied. "With the evidence we've got, she's facing fraud charges. She won't be running anything again anytime soon." When I hung up, I went outside. The air felt different, lighter, freer. The broken gate had been cleared away, replaced temporarily with orange cones and open access. Cars came and went without needing codes or permissions. It was just normal. Neighbors started waving again. Kids played on the sidewalks. For the first time, Maplewood Estates actually looked like the peaceful community we were promised. But as I stood there watching, couldn't shake one thought. It should never have taken something this extreme to wake people up. And yet, that's what happens in places like this. Rules meant to protect turn into weapons. Power meant to organize turns into obsession. And the people who stand by, hoping to stay uninvolved, become part of the silence that lets it grow. That morning, the mail arrived, a thick envelope addressed to me. Inside was a letter from the interim HOA board. "Dear Mr. Dawson, we want to formally apologize for the actions taken against you and your family. Effective immediately, all prior fines and citations have been voided. You have our gratitude for bringing the truth to light." At the bottom were 12 signatures, neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak. I folded the letter, set it aside, and walked to the edge of the property where the gate once stood. Beyond the open road, sunlight spilled across the pavement, warm and unbroken. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like freedom. Still, I couldn't help but wonder how many other neighborhoods live under someone like Karen. Someone hiding behind the word community to feed their control. How many families are still trapped behind gates they didn't build? It had been 3 months since the morning I tore through the Maplewood Estates gate. The scars of that day still lingered. On the pavement, on people's faces, even in the quiet pauses of conversation when someone mentioned Karen's name. But the neighborhood was changing, slowly shedding the fear that had defined it for years. The first sign came with the sound of laughter, something we hadn't heard in a long time. Kids were riding their bikes again, weaving through the cul-de-sac without worrying about noise violations. Neighbors who used to hide behind closed blinds were now planting flowers together, repainting fences, and talking freely in driveways. For the first time since moving here, Maplewood Estates actually felt alive. Karen's arrest had made headlines. HOA president detained for obstructing emergency responders. The story spread faster than wildfire, sparking debates online about HOA power abuse. People from other states left comments saying, "That's my neighborhood too," or "I wish someone would stand up to our board." I didn't want fame. I didn't even want recognition. I just wanted peace. But sometimes peace only comes after a storm. Karen's trial was swift. The investigation uncovered more than anyone expected. Years of embezzled HOA funds, false invoices, and doctored inspection reports. She'd been running her own personal empire under the cover of community service. When the charges finally came, fraud, obstruction, and abuse of authority, the sentence was inevitable. She was found guilty. The day the verdict came down, I stood outside the courthouse. The air was crisp, autumn leaves tumbling across the steps. Reporters hovered nearby, cameras ready, hoping for a quote. I didn't give them one. I just watched as Karen was led out in handcuffs, the same way she'd once watched me being taken away months before. For a moment, our eyes met. Hers were hollow, a mixture of disbelief and something that almost looked like shame. I didn't feel triumph, just closure. I thought about saying something about how no one should ever wield power like that again. But then I realized she already knew. Losing her control was punishment enough. When I got home, my wife was sitting on the porch, our son asleep in her arms. The late afternoon light spilled across the yard, golden and calm. I hadn't seen her smile like that in months. She looked up and said softly, "It's over." And for the first time, I believed her. In the weeks that followed, the HOA rebuilt, not just the gate, but the trust that Karen had shattered. The new board was made up of real neighbors, a retired teacher, a young couple, a local firefighter, and even Mrs. Patel from across the street, who'd once been too nervous to attend meetings. Their first act wasn't to create more rules, it was to repeal most of the old ones. Gone were the fines for unauthorized holiday lights, the approved color palette, and the ridiculous policy about trash cans. Instead, they voted for common sense, compassion, and community-first values. We even had a small neighborhood barbecue. The first one in years. No permission forms. No checklists. Just laughter, music, and the smell of burgers on the grill. Detective Monroe stopped by briefly. She handed me a small envelope. "For you," she said. Inside was an official letter from the sheriff's department, confirming that all charges against me had been dropped. They'd reviewed the footage, the ambulance logs, and community testimonies, and determined my actions, while extreme, had been provoked by negligence that endangered a child's life. In other words, justified. I thanked her quietly. Before she left, she said something I'll never forget. "You'd be surprised how many HOAs we deal with," she said. "People think a title or a clipboard gives them power. But the moment they start believing rules matter more than people, that's when the rot sets in." I nodded, understanding every word. As the months passed, the bulldozed gate was replaced, not with another steel barrier, but a simple wooden archway covered in climbing vines. No locks, no keypad. Just open access, a symbol of what the community wanted to become again. I still get looks sometimes, the kind that say, "That's the guy who drove the bulldozer." Some are judgmental, others admiring. I don't mind either. Because behind every glance is a quiet acknowledgement that it took something drastic to set things right. Life eventually found its rhythm again. I returned to work, our son grew stronger every day, and my wife started smiling more. The garden bloomed again. Lavender, daisies, and soft grass where once there had been tension. But every so often, I'd catch myself staring down the street, toward where that old iron gate once stood. And I'd remember. Not the roar of the bulldozer or the chaos that followed, but the silence right after. The silence that felt like freedom. 6 months later, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in the mail, not from the HOA, but from a lawyer representing a new development nearby. They'd heard about what happened and wanted to hire me as a consultant for a community relations committee. I laughed out loud when I read it. Me, the guy who bulldozed an HOA gate, being asked to help another one. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Maybe people needed someone who'd lived through it, who understood how easily power could twist into punishment. So I accepted. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about remembering why neighborhoods exist in the first place, to bring people together, not drive them apart. Not long after, I drove by the courthouse again. Out of curiosity, I asked one of the clerks what happened to Karen. "She's serving time at the county facility," the clerk said. "Eligible for parole in 2 years." I didn't feel hatred. It's pity. Somewhere along the way, she'd convinced herself that order was the same thing as control, and when people stopped fearing her, she had nothing left. Power had become her prison long before the bars did. A year later, our neighborhood had changed completely. The lawns were still neat, but not because anyone forced them to be. Kids' bikes leaned against fences. Porch swings creaked. Even the once silent HOA newsletter had turned into a community bulletin full of potlucks and volunteer drives. Every time I saw a new family moving in, I made it a point to walk over and introduce myself to make sure they felt welcome from day one. Because I knew how fragile that welcome could be if the wrong person held the pen. Sometimes people asked about the gate story. I didn't hide it. I told them the truth, every painful, ridiculous, infuriating detail. Not as a badge of honor, but as a warning. Never let your community forget its humanity. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there would think twice before turning a neighborly rulebook into a weapon. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Maplewood, I took my son, now a healthy, laughing toddler, for a walk around the block. He pointed to the flowers, the dogs, the kids on scooters. He didn't know what this place had been before. The fear, the fines, the gates. To him, it was just home. We stopped under the new wooden archway, the one covered in vines. Someone had hung a small sign from it that read, "Welcome, all neighbors." I stood there for a long time, watching the golden light filter through the leaves. That's when I realized the full circle of it all. Karen had built walls. I'd torn one down. But what came after that wasn't destruction. It was rebuilding. Not just of the gate or the HOA, but of what a neighborhood could be when people chose empathy over authority. When I carried my son back home, I looked around the same street, the same houses, but a completely different world. A free one. And as I stood on my porch, I couldn't help but wonder how many others were still trapped behind their own gates, invisible or otherwise, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally push back. Because the truth is, you don't need a bulldozer to tear down a wall. Sometimes, all it takes is refusing to bow to the people who build them. And that's the real lesson of Maplewood Estates, that no rule, no title. And no HOA bylaw is stronger than a community that decides it's done being afraid. When I tell this story now, people always ask me the same question. Was it worth it? The fines. The fear. The bulldozer. The trial. I look at my son, alive and smiling. I look at my wife, laughing with the neighbors she once avoided. I look at the open street, free of gates and codes and threats. And I answer every time, without hesitation, yes. Every second of it. Because sometimes peace isn't given, it's reclaimed. And the sound of a bulldozer breaking through tyranny. That's what freedom sounds like.